Michael stared at his reflection in the gleaming elevator doors of Barrett and Shaw International, straightening his tie one last time before his morning meeting. 6 years at the company had taught him every subtle detail of its corporate culture, from the exact shade of confidence needed in his smile to the precise moment to laugh at Richard Walsh's jokes. Richard, his mentor, his boss, and the man he'd trusted with every brilliant idea he'd conceived over the past half-decade. The memory of their first meeting still felt crisp in Michael's mind. Richard had been different from the other executives, warmer, more approachable. "I see something special in you, kid," he'd said, clapping Michael's shoulder after his first successful presentation. That moment had set the tone for their relationship, Richard the wise guide, Michael the eager protégé. Their collaboration had seemed perfect. Every Friday afternoon, they'd meet in Richard's corner office, the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly behind his desk as they brainstormed ways to revolutionize the company's approach to client acquisition. Michael would come armed with research and innovative strategies, and Richard would help refine them, adding his years of experience to Michael's fresh perspective. "This could change everything," Richard had said when Michael first presented his digital transformation initiative. The project would streamline client onboarding through AI-driven analytics, potentially saving the company millions while dramatically improving customer satisfaction. Michael had spent months developing it, working late into the night, fueled by Richard's enthusiastic encouragement. But something changed 3 months ago. Richard's demeanor shifted subtly, so subtly that Michael initially dismissed his unease as paranoia. The Friday meetings became less frequent, with Richard citing scheduling conflicts. When they did meet, he seemed distracted, taking more phone calls than usual, his notes increasingly sparse. Then came the quarterly board meeting. Michael wasn't invited, despite having contributed to several major projects under discussion. He told himself it was normal, he wasn't senior enough yet. But that evening, as he was gathering his things to leave, Sarah from IT stopped by his desk. "Great presentation today," she said, her voice carrying an odd note. Michael looked up, confused. "I wasn't at the board meeting." Sarah's expression shifted from friendly to uncomfortable. "Oh. I just assumed. I mean, the digital transformation initiative they approved was brilliant. Richard really knocked it out of the park with that one." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He managed to maintain his composure until Sarah left, then immediately pulled up the board meeting minutes on the company's internal network. There it was, his entire project, every detail he'd meticulously crafted, presented as Richard's brainchild. Even the graphics in the presentation were copied from his original drafts, though the "created by" field now bore Richard's name. That night, Michael barely slept. He pored over emails, project documents, and meeting notes, discovering a pattern he'd been too trusting to see. Richard hadn't just stolen the digital transformation initiative, he'd been gradually taking credit for Michael's ideas for months, building his own reputation on the foundation of Michael's creativity. The next week passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. Michael maintained his usual routine, all while documenting everything. He noted every inconsistency in Richard's claims, every meeting where his ideas had mysteriously become his boss's innovations. He even discovered that Richard had been quietly removing him from email chains where his contributions were clearly documented. Then came the email from HR about a restructuring meeting. Michael knew what it meant before he even opened the calendar invite. As he sat in the sterile conference room, listening to the rehearsed speech about organizational changes and budget constraints, he watched Richard's face. His mentor wore an expression of practiced concern, but there was something else in his eyes, a glint of satisfaction, quickly masked by professional sympathy. "I fought for you," Richard said afterward, catching Michael in the hallway. "But you know how these things go. I'll write you an excellent recommendation letter." Michael nodded, thanked him politely, and walked to his desk to begin packing his things. But inside, something had crystallized, a cold, clear purpose that would shape everything that followed. The next morning, instead of sleeping in like most newly unemployed people might, Michael was up at 5. He spent the first week meticulously organizing the evidence he'd gathered, creating a clear timeline of Richard's systematic theft of his intellectual property. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. Richard was too skilled at office politics to be brought down by a simple paper trail. Michael needed to understand the bigger picture. He began reaching out to former colleagues who'd left the company, carefully crafting each conversation to seem like innocent catching up. Patterns emerged. Richard had done this before, though never quite so boldly. His previous victims had either been too junior to fight back or had been offered attractive positions at other companies, positions that conveniently came with non-disclosure agreements. But Richard had made a crucial mistake with Michael. He'd taught him too well, shown him too much about how the game was really played. Every connection Richard had cultivated, every weakness he'd exposed in casual conversation, every shortcut he'd taken, Michael remembered them all. The plan came together gradually, like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. First, Michael launched his own consulting firm, specifically targeting the mid-sized companies that formed Barrett and Shaw's core client base. His pitch was simple: he could deliver the same results as the big firms, but with more personal attention and innovative solutions. The digital transformation initiative became his calling card, though he presented it differently now, streamlined, improved, and tailored to each potential client's needs. He was careful never to mention Barrett and Shaw or Richard by name, but word began to spread through the industry about the promising new firm that was revolutionizing client acquisition processes. Meanwhile, Michael maintained careful surveillance of his former workplace through the network of relationships he'd built. He learned that Richard, emboldened by his successful appropriation of Michael's ideas, had become increasingly careless. He'd begun taking shortcuts in implementation, modifying reports to hide deteriorating results, and making promises to clients that the stripped-down version of Michael's systems couldn't possibly fulfill. The descent, when it came, was swift and merciless. An anonymous tip to the company's largest investors led to an audit of Richard's department. Discrepancies were discovered. Clients, already frustrated by poor results, began to ask pointed questions about the promises they'd been made. The same political skills that had aided Richard's rise now worked against him. Too many people were eager to share stories of his creative approach to credit and accountability. 3 months into Michael's carefully orchestrated campaign, Richard's position had become untenable. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Jessica Chen, a junior analyst Richard had recently hired. She discovered irregularities in his department's performance metrics while preparing for a client presentation. Instead of hiding them as Richard demanded, she took them directly to the board. The investigation that followed was brutal and comprehensive. Every project, every report, every client interaction was scrutinized. Michael watched from afar as his former mentor's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He took no direct action during this time. He didn't need to. Richard's own paranoia did more damage than any external attack could have. In meetings, he became defensive, even hostile. Longtime allies began to distance themselves, sensing the shifting winds. Sarah from IT, the same person who had inadvertently revealed Richard's theft to Michael, was the one who sent him the video. The company had called an all-hands meeting to address the ongoing situation in client services. In the grainy footage from someone's phone, Michael watched Richard sitting alone on one side of the conference room, his usual confident posture replaced by a defeated slump. The CEO's words were measured but devastating. Integrity and trust featured prominently, along with immediate termination and potential legal consequences. But Michael's revenge wasn't complete. He had one final card to play, one that would ensure Richard truly understood the depth of his miscalculation. Through careful networking, Michael had learned that Richard had been quietly interviewing at several other firms in the industry. Each time, mysterious emails would arrive at these companies just before Richard's final interviews, detailing his history of intellectual property theft and data manipulation. The rejection letters piled up. Richard's carefully curated LinkedIn profile grew increasingly desperate, moving from seeking new opportunities to open to work to finally available immediately. His industry contacts stopped returning his calls. The prestigious consulting firms that had once courted him now wouldn't even grant him an initial screening. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Richard finally swallowed his pride. Michael was reviewing quarterly projections with his growing team when his assistant announced an unscheduled visitor. Richard stood in the reception area of Michael's sleek downtown office, his designer suit slightly wrinkled, his confident smile replaced by something more uncertain. "Michael," he began, then faltered. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and realizations. "I've been doing some consulting work," Richard continued finally, his voice carefully neutral. "But I've been following your company's success. The way you've implemented the digital transformation strategy, it's impressive. Better than what I did at Barrett and Shaw." Michael leaned back in his chair, studying the man who had once loomed so large in his professional life. Richard looked smaller somehow, diminished not just by his circumstances but by the weight of his own choices. "I've learned a lot about innovation since then," Richard pressed on, his desperation showing through his practiced pitch. "I have valuable experience, connections in the industry. I could be an asset to your team." The irony wasn't lost on Michael. Here was Richard, trying to leverage ideas he had stolen to get a job with their original creator. For a moment, he was tempted to draw out the conversation, to make Richard grovel a bit more. But he had learned something important during his months of calculated revenge: true power lay not in humiliation, but in choice. "You're right about one thing," Michael said finally, his voice level. "The implementation here is better. Do you know why?" He didn't wait for Richard's response. "Because every person on my team knows their ideas will be heard, valued, and credited appropriately. Trust isn't just a corporate buzzword here, it's the foundation of everything we build." Richard's face flushed, the implications of Michael's words hitting home. "I made mistakes," he admitted, "but I've changed. If you just give me a chance. "No," Michael interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "You haven't changed, Richard. You're still trying to profit from other people's work, you're just more desperate about it now." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "I learned a lot from you, though. You taught me exactly what kind of leader I didn't want to be." As security escorted Richard out, Michael watched through his office window. His former mentor's shoulders were slumped, his walk lacking its usual confident swagger. The victory should have felt sweeter, more satisfying. Instead, Michael felt a strange emptiness, a hollow space where his anger had lived for so long. That evening, as he worked late in his office, Michael found himself staring at the email Richard had sent asking for the meeting. The subject line read, "Looking to make amends." He considered all the ways he could further destroy Richard's career. He certainly had enough evidence, enough connections now to ensure Richard never worked in the industry again. It would be easy, perhaps even justified. Instead, he clicked delete. But the story didn't end there. News of Richard's downfall spread through the industry like wildfire, each retelling adding new layers of speculation and rumor. Some said he'd been caught selling company secrets to competitors. Others claimed he'd been running a complex fraud scheme. The truth, that he'd simply been stealing credit for others' work, seemed almost mundane in comparison, yet it resonated deeply with everyone who'd ever felt undervalued or exploited in their career. Michael's company, meanwhile, continued to thrive. His genuine approach to innovation and leadership attracted talented people who'd grown weary of traditional corporate politics. Sarah from IT joined his team 6 months after Richard's visit, bringing with her a wealth of knowledge about digital security and, more importantly, a commitment to ethical business practices that aligned perfectly with the company's culture. 1 year to the day after Richard's humiliation, Michael received an unexpected email. It was from Jessica Chen, the junior analyst whose integrity had helped expose Richard's deceptions. She was looking for a new position and wondered if Michael might be hiring. The email included a portfolio of her recent work, along with a personal note explaining how the experience with Richard had shaped her professional values. As Michael reviewed her impressive credentials, he found himself reflecting on the cyclical nature of corporate life. Here was someone who'd played a crucial role in his revenge, now seeking to join his team. The old Michael might have seen it as another opportunity for manipulation, another chess piece to position. But he'd learned that building something meaningful was more satisfying than destroying someone else's creation. He invited Jessica for an interview, not because of her role in Richard's downfall, but because her work showed genuine innovation and integrity. During their meeting, neither of them mentioned Richard directly, but his shadow lingered in their careful discussions about corporate culture and ethical leadership. "I have to ask," Jessica said near the end of their conversation, "how do you maintain such a positive environment here? Everyone I've talked to says this place is different." Michael thought carefully before responding. "We're transparent about our mistakes as well as our successes," he said finally. "And we understand that true innovation doesn't come from one person, it comes from creating an environment where everyone feels safe sharing their ideas." As Jessica left his office, Michael caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked different from the eager young executive who'd once trusted Richard Walsh without question. The experience had changed him, certainly, but not in the ways he'd expected. His revenge had been complete, meticulously planned, and perfectly executed, yet its greatest value lay not in Richard's downfall, but in the lessons it had taught him about leadership, trust, and the true meaning of success. Later that evening, as Michael prepared to leave the office, he noticed a small card on his desk. It was an invitation to speak at an upcoming industry conference about innovative leadership practices. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would be speaking to a room full of executives about fostering trust and creativity, lessons he'd learned through betrayal and revenge. He thought about declining. After all, public speaking had never been his favorite part of the job. But as he read through the conference details, something caught his eye. The panel would be discussing the future of corporate culture and the importance of ethical leadership in the digital age. The same themes that had dominated his own journey from betrayed employee to successful founder. Michael pulled up his calendar and accepted the invitation. He had a story to tell, not about revenge, but about transformation. About how sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most important revelations. About how success isn't measured by who you can bring down, but by who you can lift up. As he gathered his things to leave, Michael's phone buzzed with a news alert. Richard had finally landed a new position, a middle management role at a small company in the Midwest, far from the prestigious corridors of Manhattan's corporate world. For a moment, Michael felt the old anger stirring, the urge to make one more call, send one more email, ensure that even this modest recovery would be denied to his former mentor. Instead, he put the phone away without reading the full article. He had a company to run, a culture to build, and a future to shape. Richard's story was finished, but Michael's was still being written. The next morning, as he rode the elevator to his office, Michael caught himself automatically straightening his tie in the reflection. Some habits died hard. But when he looked at his face, he saw something different from the ambitious young executive who'd once done the same in Barrett and Shaw's elevators. His eyes held a wisdom that could only come from experiencing both betrayal and the hollow victory of revenge. The doors opened to a busy Monday morning. His team was already gathering for their weekly innovation meeting, a tradition he'd started to ensure every voice was heard, every contribution recognized. As he walked through the office, greeting people by name, remembering their projects and ideas, Michael realized that this, not the satisfaction of watching Richard's downfall, was his true revenge. He had built something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal, something that would last long after the story of Richard Walsh's deception had faded into corporate legend. The conference room was full of bright minds and eager faces, each person ready to share their vision for the future. Michael took his seat, not at the head of the table as Richard would have done, but among his team. He'd learned that the best ideas could come from anywhere, and true leadership meant creating space for those ideas to flourish. "Good morning, everyone," he began, looking around the table. Who wants to go first?